For those who love the things they should not want, and want them anyway. Rome did not mourn quietly. The city wore grief like a theatre costume, magnificent, excessive, and performative in the way only Romans understood, as though sorrow itself demanded an audience. Black bunting draped from the iron balconies along Via della Croce. Flowers, white lilies, white roses, offerings so pale they looked like surrender, were piled 3 feet high against the iron gates of the Esposito compound in Parioli. Women in black pressed handkerchiefs to their faces. Men stood with their hands clasped, their jaws hard, their eyes moving everywhere and seeing everything, the way men in their profession always did. Inside the cortege, behind the dark glass of a car that cost more than most Romans earned in 5 years, Fiora Esposito sat perfectly still. She was 28 years old. She had been a wife for 6 of those years. She was a widow now, and she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had grown up inside this world rather than stumbling into it, that these 2 facts would define every remaining day of her life. Her hands were folded in her lap, black gloves, black dress, black veil that fell from the brim of a hat so elegant it belonged in another century. Someone, she thought it was her mother-in-law Silvana, had chosen it for her. Fiora herself had not chosen anything since the night 2 weeks ago when Salvatore Esposito had been found dead in his car outside the Borghese Gallery. 3 bullets arranged in him with professional precision, and her entire life had folded in on itself like a piece of paper being reduced to ash. She did not cry. This was noted. She knew it was noted. She could feel the eyes of Salvatore's brothers, Marco and Aldo, on her from the seat across the car, measuring her grief the way they measured everything, as currency, as evidence, as leverage. "You should weep," Silvana said, sitting beside her. The old woman's voice was low, meant only for Fiora. "They are watching." "They are always watching," Fiora said. "See, so weep." Fiora turned to look at her mother-in-law, this woman who had ruled the domestic architecture of the Esposito family for 40 years, who had buried a husband and 2 sons, and still sat with her spine straight as a church pillar. Silvana's eyes were black and unreadable behind her veil. There was no cruelty in the instruction. There was only practicality, the hard pragmatism of a woman who had learned survival inside the same walls that had housed Fiora for 6 years. "I cannot," Fiora said quietly. Silvana looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned away, toward the window, toward the streets of Rome sliding past in their ancient indifference. "Then God help you," she said. The funeral mass was held at Sant'Agnese in Agone because the Espositos had donated a substantial portion of the nave's restoration fund, and this brought them a particular kind of grace. The priest spoke of Salvatore as though he had been a good man, a family man, a man taken too soon by forces beyond understanding. Fiora sat in the front pew and kept her eyes on the casket and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe that any of those things were true. She had been 22 when she married him, the daughter of Enzo de Luca, a man of moderate position in the Roman underworld, connected enough to be valuable, not powerful enough to be a threat. The marriage had been her father's idea, his great ambition, his arrangement. Salvatore Esposito was the boss of one of the 4 families that divided Rome between them like slices of a bloody pie. Marrying his daughter to Salvatore had been Enzo's masterwork. Fiora had been the currency of that transaction, and she had known it, and she had gone into it with her eyes open, because she had been raised to understand that this was how it worked. She had not loved Salvatore. She had respected him occasionally. She had feared him often. She had managed him the way one managed a volatile force of nature, carefully, intelligently, with constant attention to the direction of the wind. And now he was dead, and she was alone, in a way she had never been allowed to be before, and the rules of her world were descending on her like a stone ceiling. The reception was held at the compound, a sprawling villa in Parioli that felt, as it always had, more like a fortress than a home. The rooms were full of men in dark suits, women in black, food that nobody ate. Fiora moved through it all with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 6 years hosting, managing, presiding. She accepted condolences, she pressed hands, she murmured the appropriate things. It was Marco who found her in the hallway outside the study, just before 7 o'clock, when the light through the tall windows had gone the colour of old amber. Marco Esposito was 41, 3 years older than Salvatore had been. He had their father's build, thick through the chest, short in the neck, with a face that had never quite achieved handsomeness, but communicated power so effectively that it didn't matter. He was the family's new patriarch now. He had been waiting for this role for a long time. "We need to speak," he said. "Of course," Fiora said, and followed him into the study. It smelled of Salvatore's cigars, a scent that would be gone within weeks once Marco took possession of the room. Marco stood at the window with his back to her, looking out at the garden where guests moved in clusters on the darkening lawn. "There are things you need to understand," he said, "about your position now." "I imagine there are." He turned. "The family will provide for you. The house in Trastevere is yours. An allowance, security, everything you need." "That's very generous." "It comes with expectations." He paused, the way powerful men paused when they wanted the weight of what came next to be felt. "You are a widow of the Esposito family, Salvatore's widow. That name carries meaning. It carries obligations." "I understand." "You will not remarry." She looked at him steadily. "The law." "The law," he confirmed. "Salvatore is 3 hours in the ground, and I tell you this now so there is no confusion later, no misunderstanding. You are Esposito in name and in deed until the day you die, Fiora. There is no man who would dare take you. There is no man who should." "And if one did?" she asked. The question came out of her before she could stop it, calm and academic, as though she were asking about a theorem. Marco's eyes went flat. "Then he would be a very foolish man." Fiora nodded once and excused herself and walked back through the rooms full of people and came to stand in the garden in the evening air and let herself breathe for the first time that day. She was 28 years old. She was a widow. She was forbidden. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet as a locked room, a door she had never let herself open began to rattle on its hinges. There were 4 families in Rome. The Espositos controlled Parioli and EUR, old money neighbourhoods where the power came wrapped in marble and silence. The Romanos held the centre, the tourist territory, the restaurants, the hotels, the endless river of cash that flowed through the city's ancient veins. The Contes operated out of Testaccio and Ostiense, the industrial quarters, the docks, the underground clubs where things happened that daylight never touched. And then there was Nero Falcone. He didn't belong to a family the way the others did. He had built his own empire from nothing, which was, in the accounting of the Roman underworld, both impressive and suspect. Men who rose from nothing were unpredictable. They didn't have the same loyalties, the same inherited codes, the same sense of obligation that came from being born into the architecture of power. They had only themselves, their ambition, and whatever morality they had constructed from scratch. Nero Falcone's morality was, by most assessments, formidable and absolutely terrifying. He was 35 years old. He operated from a penthouse on the top floor of a building on the Lungotevere that overlooked the Tiber with the casual arrogance of something that had always been there. He owned 3 nightclubs, 2 restaurants, a shipping company, and a controlling interest in a private bank that handled money for people who could not explain where it came from. On paper, he was a successful businessman. In practice, he was the most dangerous man in a city full of dangerous men. He had been Salvatore Esposito's greatest enemy. This was not the word they used. In the formal architecture of the 4 families, rival was the polite term, and rivalry implied a certain parity, a mutual recognition, a dance between equals. Salvatore and Nero had danced for 3 years, circling each other's territory, probing each other's defences, fighting proxy wars through intermediaries and business deals, and the occasional disappearance of men who had been inconveniently loyal to the other side. Nero had won most of those battles. He was better at them. He thought 3 moves ahead, where Salvatore thought 2, and he had no sentimentality about the pieces on the board. He was sitting at the bar of his most exclusive club, Ossidiana, on Via Veneto, where the tables cost €5,000 a night and nobody asked questions, when word reached him that Salvatore Esposito was dead. His head of security, a Sicilian named Ciro, with the face of a disappointed saint, leaned down and murmured it in his ear, and Nero received the information the way he received most information, with absolute stillness. He sat with his bourbon for a moment, looking at the room. The club was half full, the kind of Thursday night crowd that came in dark suits and light conversation, and understood instinctively that this was not a place for ordinary displays of anything. Music played from somewhere that couldn't be seen. The light was low and amber, the same colour as the drink in his hand. "How?" he asked. 3 rounds, professional placement, outside the Borghese. Nero considered this. Who? Unknown. Find out. Ciro nodded and straightened and withdrew, and Nero was left with his drink and the music and the news that the primary obstacle in his professional life had been removed by someone other than himself. He should have felt satisfied. He felt, instead, a strange unease that he couldn't immediately name. He thought about Fiora. He had seen her exactly 4 times. This was not the kind of fact a man like Nero Falcone should have known precisely. He dealt in approximate knowledge, in rough geographies of intelligence, but he knew this number with complete certainty because he had counted them, which was itself a thing he didn't care to examine too closely. The first time, 18 months ago, at a charity gala at the Palazzo Farnese, one of those events the Roman elite used to launder their social consciences. She had been standing at a window overlooking the courtyard, alone for perhaps 30 seconds, before someone claimed her attention, wearing a dress the colour of old wine, her dark hair pinned up in a way that showed the clean line of her neck. He had watched her for those 30 seconds with an attention that was not appropriate, and that he had been unable to help. The second time, a restaurant on the Piazza Navona 6 months later, where she had been lunching with another woman. Salvatore had not been present. Nero had been at a table on the other side of the room, conducting business, and had spent approximately 20 minutes aware of her existence with a portion of his mind that he reserved for threats. She was not a threat. That was the problem. She was Salvatore Esposito's wife, and looking at her was something Nero had decided was categorically inadmissible. And the fact that he looked anyway told him something about himself that he found inconvenient. The third time had been at a cocktail party, brief, a moment in which they had been almost introduced. Someone had started to say his name in her direction, and then, with the social seismograph of Rome's elite, had thought better of it and pivoted smoothly away. She had glanced at him in that moment, a glance so brief it was barely a transaction, and he had felt it like a small, calibrated blow to his chest. The fourth time, 3 weeks ago, before Salvatore was killed. On the Ponte Sisto, in the early morning, she had been walking alone, no security, which told him something about the state of the Esposito marriage, moving through the blue light before sunrise, wearing a long coat, her face unguarded in the way faces were before the city woke up and reminded you to perform yourself. He had been returning from a meeting that could not be held in daylight. They had passed each other on the bridge, with perhaps 2 meters between them. She had looked at him. He had looked at her. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Nero Falcone, a man who had built an empire on the controlled application of emotion, had thought, "I know you." Which was insane, because he didn't, because they had never spoken, because she was married to his enemy and therefore existed in a category labelled "do not touch," that he honoured not out of sentiment, but out of the cold, pragmatic intelligence that recognised some fires as too costly to start. And now Salvatore was dead, and she was alone. And a thing that had been dormant in Nero's chest was doing something that he found profoundly inconvenient. He finished his bourbon and set the glass down precisely on the bar. "Ciro," he said, and his head of security materialized from the shadows with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent 20 years learning to disappear. "The Esposito funeral," Nero said. "Find out when." Ciro's expression shifted by perhaps 1 millimeter. "You're going to attend?" "No." A pause. "But I want to know." 6 weeks after the funeral, Fiora moved back into her own skin. This was what it felt like. Not a decision, not an event, but a slow reoccupation of her own body and mind, as though she had been standing outside herself during those first weeks of widowhood, watching from a polite distance while grief and protocol and other people's expectations moved through the space she inhabited. Then one morning she woke up in the Trastevere house and looked at the ceiling and thought, "I am here. I am still here." It was not joy. It was not even relief. It was something more fundamental, the simple cellular insistence of being alive. She spent the morning in her garden, which was small and walled, and full of the kind of quiet that Parioli had never offered. Trastevere was a neighbourhood that belonged to artists and young people and tourists who had wandered off the main path, and there was a freedom in it that the Esposito compound had never permitted. She drank coffee on the stone bench beside the rose bushes and listened to the city wake up around the walls. The security detail Marco had assigned her was 2 men, stationed in a car outside. They were not subtle. They were not meant to be. They were a statement as much as a service. She was reading when her phone rang. The number was her father's. "Papa?" "Fiora." Enzo De Luca's voice was rough and warm in equal measure, a voice that had read her bedtime stories and also ordered men to be hurt. "Are you well?" "I'm managing." "I need to come and see you." "Of course. When?" "Today, if you'll permit me." A pause. "There are things we should discuss." She understood, from the careful way he said this, that whatever was coming was something he would have preferred not to carry to her. Her father was not a man who shied from difficult conversations as a rule, but he had a particular register, a gentled, deliberate care that he used exclusively with her, and he was using it now. "Come for lunch," she said. He arrived at noon with a bunch of flowers that seemed entirely unlike him, as though someone had advised him to bring them. He was 63 now, thickened through the middle, his hair gone from black to silver in the years since her mother's death. He kissed her on both cheeks and accepted coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the flowers lying on the counter behind him like an afterthought. They talked first about ordinary things, her health, the house, whether she was eating. He asked about her brother Gianluca, who was 23 and working somewhere in the Esposito organization, a fact that Fiora thought about with persistent, low-level anxiety. She told him Gianluca had come to the funeral and looked too thin. Enzo nodded and said he would speak to him. Then the ordinary things ran out, and they were left with the difficult one. "Marco came to see me," her father said. Fiora set her cup down. "When?" "Last week. He wanted to be sure that I understood, that we both understood, the nature of your situation. He explained it to me at the funeral. He wanted to make certain you had heard it from your own father as well." Enzo looked at her with the expression of a man who had made many compromises in his life and had learned too late which ones had cost him most. "The law, Fiora. You know what it is." "I know what it is." "Then you know that Marco is not speaking carelessly. It is the law of the families. Has been for as long as there have been families." She kept her voice even. "A widow of the organization belongs to the family of her husband. She cannot remarry without the family's blessing, which is never given. She cannot take a companion of consequence. She exists in suspension." "It protects her," Enzo said, and she could hear in his voice that he half believed it, and half hated himself for half believing it. "It protects the family," she said, "from complications, from the possibility that she might one day give information or loyalty or access to someone outside the family. I understand the logic perfectly." "Fiora, I'm not angry, Papa." She looked at him steadily. "I'm 28 years old, and I will live in this city for the rest of my life, and I will be Salvatore's widow until I die. I understand what that means. I understood it when I married him." But she hadn't, not really. She had understood it in the abstract, the way you understood that cliffs were dangerous before you stood at the edge of one. The understanding was different now. The understanding had a specific gravity to it, a texture, a taste. It tasted like the coffee growing cold in her cup, and the silence of the house around her, and the fact that she was 28 years old, and her life had already arrived at its permanent shape. "Your mother," Enzo began, and stopped. "What about her?" He looked at his hands. She would have known what to say to you. I don't. I only know that I am sorry, and that the choice I made when you were 22 was— He paused. I believed it was for the best. I believed Salvatore would take care of you. He did, after his fashion. He was not kind to you. No, Fiora agreed. He was not. But I am alive, and I have this house, and I have learned quite a lot about taking care of myself. She reached across and covered her father's hand with hers. Don't apologize to me today. I don't have room for it. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his face that she recognized. The love of a man who understood that he had done something unforgivable and had decided to live with it anyway, because the alternative was to come apart entirely. After he left, she went back into the garden and sat for a long time with the afternoon light moving across the stone. Forbidden. It was an old-fashioned word. It had the texture of fairy tales and biblical commandments, of things that belonged to other centuries. But here she was, in the 21st century, in a city of 4 million people, and the word applied to her with the precision of a key in a lock. She was thinking about this when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. I heard what Marco told you. I'm sorry. N. She stared at the message for a long time. She did not reply. But she did not delete it either. She went to the club because Valentina made her. Valentina Ricci was 31, divorced from a Romano family lieutenant with a settlement that kept her in Gucci and free of obligations, and she had been Fiora's closest friend since they were both 18 and attending the kind of social events where girls from connected families were circulated like currency. Valentina was fearless in the way that women who had survived bad marriages sometimes were, as though having passed through fire, she had decided that most other things were survivable too. You have been in that house for 8 weeks, Valentina said over the phone on a Saturday in mid-November. 8 weeks, Fiora. I love you, but I will not pretend that this is healthy. I've been out. Grocery shopping does not count, and neither does visiting your father. You need to be out, among people, in the world. You need to remember that you are alive and 30 years old, 28, and that your life did not end with his. Fiora was standing at her bedroom window, watching the street below. The security car was there, as always, 2 shapes in the dark. She thought about Marco's face in the study, the way he'd said, "There is no man who would dare." "All right," she said. Ossidiana was on Via Veneto, which was an address that carried its own mythology, La Dolce Vita, the ghosts of Fellini's Rome, the beautiful people of a different era. The building had been something else before Nero Falcone bought it and gutted it and rebuilt it from the inside, keeping the facade of Baroque stone, but replacing everything within with something that felt like the inside of a very expensive, very dark jewel. Fiora knew whose club it was. She had known from the moment Valentina suggested it, and she had said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. They arrived at 10 o'clock, which was early by Roman nightlife standards, but late enough that the space was half full and the atmosphere had found its register. Low, dark, expensive, with the particular electricity of rooms where people came to be looked at. A hostess in black brought them to a corner table without being asked, which told Fiora that Valentina had called ahead, and they ordered drinks, and Valentina immediately began cataloguing the room with the cheerful ruthlessness of a woman who had decided that observation was a contact sport. Fiora was not cataloguing the room. She was looking at her champagne glass and wondering what she was doing here, and what the message from N had meant, and whether the fact that she'd saved the number to her phone under no name at all was the action of a sane person. She had not replied to the message. 3 weeks had passed. She had read it perhaps 40 times. I heard what Marco told you. I'm sorry. Sorry for the law, or sorry she was in it? And how had you known? And why had he messaged her at all? And what did it mean that she had thought about those 10 words with a frequency that was disproportionate to their content? She was thinking about this when Valentina said, with the controlled excitement of someone who had spotted exactly what she'd hoped to spot, "Don't look up." Fiora looked up. Nero Falcone was moving through his own club the way a current moved through water. Not urgently, not obviously, but with a force that everything else organized itself around. He was taller than she had registered on the bridge, or perhaps it was the room, the way the light found him. He wore a dark suit without a tie, the collar of his shirt open, and he moved with the specific ease of a man who had never once in his adult life been uncertain about whether he belonged somewhere. His face was the kind of face that took a moment to fully arrive in your comprehension, sharp-angled, composed, with dark eyes that scanned the room with the methodical attention of someone who had been trained to account for every variable. He was heading for a table in the back. Then he saw her. The movement didn't stop. The scan of the room didn't stutter. Nothing so obvious as that. But something shifted. She would have struggled to describe it to anyone who hadn't been watching precisely as she was watching. And she was watching, she realized, with a precision she had not deployed since the last time they had been in proximity to each other. He changed direction. It was subtle. It might not have been obvious to anyone but her. He was heading toward her table. "Oh," Valentina said softly, with a note in her voice that Fiora did not have time to pass. He stopped at their table. His security detail had halted at a discreet distance. He looked at Fiora the way he had looked at her on the bridge, directly, without performance, as though looking at her was a simple, factual act that he had decided not to complicate. "Signora Esposito," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything at all. "Signor Falcone," she said. "I hope you're enjoying the club." "Very much." A beat. The room continued around them, indifferent. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. She looked at him. The condolence was standard, the kind of thing everyone had said for 8 weeks, but in his mouth it sounded different, not performed, not obligatory. It sounded like a sentence that had been edited carefully for accuracy. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, and then he said, very quietly, so that only she could hear it clearly, "My message. I didn't know if you received it." "I received it." His eyes held hers. This lasted perhaps 3 seconds and felt significantly longer. "Good evening," he said, and moved away toward his table. Valentina waited until he was out of range, and then turned to Fiora with an expression of absolute theatrical fascination. "Fiora Esposito," she said. "What in God's name was that?" "A condolence," Fiora said, and drank her champagne, and did not look toward his table for the rest of the evening. which required a degree of sustained effort that she found informative. Marco Esposito found out within 48 hours. This was not surprising. Marco had eyes in every significant room in Rome, which was one of the reasons he had survived to become the head of the family, while Salvatore had not. He called her on a Tuesday morning, not on her personal number, but on the old landline at the Trastevere house, a detail that was itself a message, a reminder that the house existed within his awareness and his generosity. "I heard you were at Ossidiana on Saturday," he said. Fiora was standing in her kitchen in her dressing gown, and she recognized, with the clarity that sometimes arrived in the still morning hours, that the way she responded in the next 30 seconds would establish a precedent she would have to live with for a long time. "Yes," she said. "Valentina took me out. I've been in the house too long." "Ossidiana is Falcone's club." "I know." "He spoke to you?" "He offered condolences. It lasted perhaps 20 seconds. A long pause. She could hear Marco breathing, the particular cadence of a man who was deciding how to be angry in a way that wouldn't require him to acknowledge his anger directly. "Fiora," he said, "you are a smart woman." "I try to be." "Then you understand what I'm about to say without me having to say it. I understand that Salvatore's widow appearing in Nero Falcone's club creates a perception that the family would prefer didn't exist," she said. "And I understand that if I continue to choose my social venues without better judgment, the security detail outside my house will be replaced with something considerably less comfortable." The silence that followed this was a different kind, the silence of a man recalibrating. "Yes," Marco said, "that's essentially it." "I'll be more careful." She hung up and stood in her kitchen and felt with absolute crystalline clarity the architecture of her life as it was now and as it would remain. The walls were visible from every angle. They were not cruel as prisons went. They were comfortable and well furnished and offered a certain kind of safety. But they were walls. She picked up her phone and composed a message to the unsaved number. "He knows I was at the club. F." The reply came in 40 seconds. "I know. I'm sorry. That wasn't my intention." She stared at it. "What was your intention?" she typed, and then deleted it. "I assumed the risk was acceptable," she typed, and then deleted that too. She put the phone down on the counter and went to make more coffee, and came back 5 minutes later and typed, "Be more careful," and sent it before she could reconsider. This time the reply took longer, 4 minutes. She found herself watching the screen with the kind of attention that was beginning to alarm her. "I will. How are you?" She read this sentence 3 times. It was such a simple question. It was the kind of question that contained, in its simplicity, a presumption. The presumption that her answer mattered, that there was a you inside the widow and the Esposito name and the law and the walls, a specific, particular individual whose state was worth asking about. "I don't know," she wrote. "How do you answer that honestly?" Most people don't. They say, "Fine," and mean, "Still here." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, unexpected, warm, real. "Still here," she typed. "Good," he wrote. And then, after a moment, "That's enough for now." She put the phone away and went back into the garden and sat with her coffee and the November light and tried to understand what was happening to her with the same cold, analytical intelligence she would have applied to any other problem. She was a widow of 8 weeks. She was under observation. She was exchanging messages with the most dangerous rival her late husband had possessed. She was doing this because of a 2-second look on a bridge 3 weeks before Salvatore died, and a text message that had said, "I'm sorry," in a way that felt, irrationally, like the most truthful thing anyone had said to her in years. She was not stupid. She understood risk. She understood consequences. She understood all of this and kept the number saved under no name, and found herself, for the first time in 8 weeks, looking forward to tomorrow. December arrived, and the city dressed itself in lights. Rome at Christmas was something that demanded response from even the most defended heart. The trees in the Piazza Navona hung with gold, the Pantheon draped in white, the streets thick with tourists and Romans moving together through the cold air with the specific urgency of people who had things to buy and places to be and music following them everywhere. Fiora moved through it, wrapped in a cashmere coat the colour of midnight, with her security detail at a distance she had learned to regard as the outermost edge of her freedom. She bought things she didn't need. She drank wine at a bar on the Campo de Fiori alone, which she had never been allowed to do before, and which felt, in its smallness, revolutionary. The messages continued. They had developed, without either of them designing it, a particular rhythm. 1 or 2 a day, sometimes late at night when the city was quiet, sometimes in the early morning before the day had built its defences. They were careful. They were not about anything that could be used against either of them. They were also, she understood, about everything. "What are you reading?" he asked one night, near midnight. "Elena Ferrante. You?" "Dostoevsky." "We're essentially the same person." She smiled at her phone in the dark of her bedroom. The Idiot or Crime and Punishment? The Brothers Karamazov, the long one. "So you have stamina." A pause, then, "Among other things." She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing. She thought about it with complete honesty, which was the only kind of honesty she had ever had access to in the private hours. She was not falling in love. She was something more complicated. She was being seen, which was different, which was in some ways more frightening. The being seen was happening through text messages sent through encrypted apps, invisible to Marco's people, and it was the most intimately she had communicated with anyone, including the man she had been married to for 6 years. "Do you read for pleasure or to understand people?" she asked, because she was curious and because asking was beginning to feel like breathing. "Both. But it's the same thing eventually. The best fiction is just a theory of human behaviour with better furniture." "What's your theory of human behaviour?" A longer pause this time. "People want to be understood more than they want to be loved, but they ask for love because it sounds more acceptable." She read this 4 times. "That's the loneliest thing I've ever read," she wrote. "Or the most honest." Are they different? In my experience, no. She thought about this for a long time, lying in the dark with the city murmuring outside her window. "Are you lonely?" she asked. The pause this time was so long she thought he might not reply. But then, "I have been for a long time. I didn't know it had a name until recently." She didn't ask him to clarify what had changed. She didn't need to. In the second week of December, they had a different kind of conversation. She had been to a dinner at her father's, a family obligation, cousins and uncles, and the particular exhausting theatre of extended De Luca gatherings. She had come home tired and sat in the dark living room without turning the lights on and messaged him because the alternative was sitting alone with the heaviness of it. "Family dinner," she wrote. "I had forgotten how tiring it is to be managed." Managed? Monitored, watched, every expression analysed for information. Whether you're grieving correctly, moving on correctly, whether you're becoming a problem. You're not a problem. I might be. Because of me? She considered this. Because of who I'm becoming without Salvatore. I was easier to manage when I was his wife. I had a function. Now I'm just architecture they have to maintain. "You're not architecture," he wrote. "You are not anyone's property, and you never were, regardless of what their law says." Something moved in her chest when she read this. Something old and stubborn and tired of being sensible. "Their law is very real," she wrote. "I know," he answered. "I didn't say it wasn't. I said you weren't property. Those are separate statements." She thought about the difference. She thought about it for a long time. "You know this will go nowhere," she wrote finally. "Not a question, a test, or a door." "I know what the obstacles are," he replied. "I also know that I've been thinking about you since a bridge in October, and that I'm done pretending that's a casual fact I can keep in a drawer." She pressed her phone against her chest and breathed. "Nero," she wrote, using his name for the first time. "Fiora," he wrote back, and it was the first time she'd seen her own name look like that, like something chosen, not inherited. They met in person for the first time in January, a meeting so carefully constructed that its architecture revealed everything about the level of deliberateness Nero brought to things he wanted. He had suggested in a message that he liked to walk along the Tiber on early Sunday mornings, before the city was fully awake. That he walked from the Lungotevere Marzio to the Lungotevere Tebaldi, and that this route at 7 o'clock in January was essentially empty. That he had mentioned this purely as information about his habits. She had read this with the full understanding of what it was, and what it wasn't, and what the risk was, and what it would mean if Marco's people were watching, and what it would mean if they weren't. On a Sunday in January, when the sky over Rome was the colour of pewter, and the Tiber ran dark between its stone banks, she went for a walk. She left her phone, the main one, the one the security detail had the number of, at home. She told the two men in the car that she was going to the nearby church for early mass, which she occasionally did, which they could verify or not. She walked. He was there. He was standing at the railing looking at the river, in a dark coat, without security, which she understood was its own statement, its own deliberate vulnerability. When she came to stand beside him, close enough to speak quietly but not close enough to touch, he turned and looked at her with the same directness she had been reading in text messages for 3 months, and she understood that the messages had been preparation for this, and that even so, she had not been entirely prepared. "You came," he said. "You waited. I would have waited longer." They stood for a moment with the river moving beneath them and the city beginning to stir somewhere behind the walls. She had not known what to expect from him in person. She had built a version of him from messages, thoughtful, precise, with an undercurrent of warmth that surprised her. She had also built a version of him from reputation, cold, controlled, dangerous in the way that very intelligent predators were dangerous because they were never careless. What she found was something that accommodated both of these things and was also, somehow, simpler. He was a man standing next to her on a bridge in January, and he was watching her with an attention that was complete without being consuming. And when he said, "How long do you have?" it sounded like he was asking about time, but meant something larger. "An hour, maybe," she said. "If I'm not back before the 9 o'clock mass ends, someone will notice. Then we'll walk." They walked. Along the river, past the plains of water-smoothed stone, past the small boats tied up at intervals, past the occasional jogger who paid them no attention. They talked, properly, for the first time, their voices in the cold air. She had expected the conversation to feel fraught, weighted with everything it meant and everything it couldn't be. Instead it felt, and she turned this word over in her mind afterward, uncertain it was right, then deciding it was, natural. As though the 3 months of messages had built something that was now simply continuing in a different medium. He asked her about her life before Salvatore. She told him about growing up in EUR, her father's house with the garden her mother had planted, the private school where she had been both the smartest girl and the most anxious, the years of understanding that her future had a predetermined shape. He listened with the specific quality of someone who was not waiting for a pause to insert their own story, but was actually taking hers in, storing it. "Did you ever want something else?" he asked. "At 18, I wanted to study art history in Florence," she said. "I wanted to live in a small apartment and eat cheap pasta and read in the afternoons." What happened to that? My father happened to it, and Salvatore, and the fact that wanting things outside the architecture of what you're born into is, she searched for the word, exhausting. You can only sustain it for so long before you start managing your wants instead. "I know something about that," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. The river made its sound below them. "I grew up in Naples," he said. "Not the part of Naples that people choose to visit. My father drove a taxi. My mother cleaned houses on the Vomero Hill. At 16, I made a choice that I understood at the time was permanent, and that I have never entirely stopped examining. Was it the right choice? It made me what I am." A beat. "Whether that's the same thing as right is a question I've been sitting with for 20 years. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The light was strengthening, the pewter sky beginning to thin toward something paler and cooler. "I should go," she said. He turned toward her, not close, but close enough that she could see the specific dark of his eyes, the small scar below his left cheekbone that she hadn't noticed before. He was looking at her the way he always had, directly, without performance, as though she were a fact he had already accepted and was simply describing. "Will you come again?" he asked. She thought about all the reasons to say no. She thought about Marco, about the law, about the walls of her particular life. She thought about the message that had said, "I've been thinking about you since a bridge in October," and the way her name had looked in his text, as though he had chosen it. "Same time next week," she said. They developed rituals the way careful people developed anything dangerous, slowly, with attention, testing each step before trusting it with weight. Sunday mornings on the Tiber, messages in the small hours, gradually, incrementally, the building of a thing that neither of them named, because naming it would require confronting what it meant. Fiora had not been naive about risk before Salvatore died. She had spent 6 years of marriage managing proximity to a man whose world operated on violence and power and the careful maintenance of appearances. She understood the mechanics of danger in her bones. But the risk she was taking now was different. Not the risk of someone else's violence bleeding into her life, but the risk of her own choice, her own deliberate action, her own decision to stand on a bridge at 7 in the morning and look at a man she should not look at. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that this kind of risk felt cleaner. They were 5 Sundays in, mid-February, the city beginning its slow warm towards spring, when the nature of what was between them shifted in a way that could not be undone or ignored. They had been walking for 40 minutes, and the conversation had moved, as it increasingly did, through layers, surface, then depth, then something below depth that had no architecture except honesty. They had been talking about loneliness, which had become one of their recurring themes. Perhaps because they had both been lonely for so long that naming it felt like discovery. "Tell me about your marriage," he said. She had been expecting this and dreading it in equal measure. "What do you want to know?" "What it cost you?" She was quiet for a moment. A pigeon launched itself from the railing ahead of them and disappeared into the cold sky. "He wasn't cruel," she said. "That's the thing that's hardest to explain to people who want a simpler story. He didn't hit me. He wasn't monstrous in the ways that would make the narrative clean. He was absent, even when he was present. His attention was always elsewhere, and the times it found me as an asset to be managed, not a person to be known." She paused. "After 6 years of that, you start to wonder if you're actually visible to anyone, if you leave a mark on the world, or just move through it and close behind you like water." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned and found him looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that bypassed the controlled surface and was simply undisguised pain, as though what she had just described had struck something in him that was not abstract. "You leave a mark," he said. His voice had a quality that she recognized from his messages at their most unguarded, stripped of performance, direct as a bone. "You have no idea," she said, "how much it matters that you say that." He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. It was the first time he had touched her. His palm was warm against her cold cheek, and the touch was so careful, so precisely calibrated between tenderness and restraint, that it made her eyes sting with something she couldn't immediately name. "Fiora," he said. "Don't," she said. He lowered his hand. His expression didn't change. "I know," he said. "I know what it is. I know all the reasons. We can't, I know." They stood there in the February cold, with the river below and the city waking around them, and all the reasons between them, and she thought about what she had said to him weeks ago. "You know this will go nowhere," and how he had not contradicted her, but had also refused to accept it as a reason to stop. "What are we doing?" she asked quietly, not quite to him. "I think we're building something that has no name yet," he said, "and I think we should let it take its time." She looked at him. "That's not a comfort," she said. "No," he agreed, "it's not." She walked home through the strengthening light and thought about his hand against her face, and how the word that had arrived in her chest when he touched her was not want or need, or even longing, but simply devastatingly recognized. That week, Marco called again. "I've had a report," he said, without preamble. She was steady. She had rehearsed steadiness. About what? "A woman seen walking along the Tiber on Sunday mornings. The description matches you." "I walk sometimes," she said. "The doctor said exercise." "Alone?" "Yes, I find it clarifies my thoughts." A pause. "The security detail should be with you." "They're outside the house. I walk in a straight line and come back. If you'd like to change the arrangement, I'm sure we can discuss it." She could hear him deciding something. "Keep the detail informed of your route," he said, "in future." "Of course," she said. She texted Nero immediately after. "He's had a report. Someone saw a woman matching my description. Be careful next week." His reply came fast. "I have a friend in Marco's operation. I'll know if it escalates. Are you safe?" "For now." "Stay that way." And then, "I think about you constantly. I thought you should know that." She sat with that for a long time. She thought about him constantly, too. March came in cold and left warm. And with the warmth came a restlessness in Fiora that she recognized as the body's rebellion against prolonged containment. She was not, by nature, a patient woman. She had performed patience for 6 years of marriage, and she had performed it well. But it had been performance rather than character, and the character underneath was increasingly unwilling to continue the act. The question of what she and Nero were doing, the thing without a name that he had said should take its time, was growing in specificity in a way that demanded accounting. She thought about him when she woke up and when she lay down, and in the long afternoon hours when the house was silent and she had nothing to do but exist inside the shape her life had taken. She thought about the way he looked at her and the way he had said her name on the bridge and the feeling of his hand against her cheek, which she replayed with a fidelity that seemed disproportionate to a 5-second touch. She was falling in love with him. She examined this fact with the same careful attention she brought to everything threatening. She looked at it from every angle. She considered its implications, not the romantic implications which were obvious and which she understood with her whole body, but the structural ones. The way it changed her risk calculus, the way it made the walls of her life, which she had been managing with cold intelligence, suddenly feel intolerable in a way they hadn't before, or hadn't enough. She was falling in love with the man Marco had specifically warned her about, the man whose name, spoken in the Esposito compound, carried the weight of territorial threat, the man who had been her dead husband's greatest enemy, who had, she thought, and the thought arrived with the precision of something she had been avoiding, perhaps been more than that. She asked him on a Wednesday night in a message, "Did you know what happened to Salvatore?" The pause before his reply lasted long enough that she understood it as its own kind of answer. "What are you asking me?" "I think you know what I'm asking." Another pause. "I didn't order it," he wrote. "I need you to believe that." "But you knew it was coming." "I knew someone wanted it done. I didn't know when. I didn't try to prevent it." She sat with this for a long time. The honesty of it was both better and worse than the alternative. If he had lied, she would have known. She had always been able to tell lies from truths, even in text, which was a skill that 6 years of marriage to a man who moved in shadow had refined to something close to a sixth sense. He hadn't lied. "Who?" she asked. "I can't tell you that. Not because I don't trust you, because the information carries consequences I won't put on you. She thought about this, about whether it was enough, about whether the standard she was applying to him was different from the standard that applied to every man in this world, including her own father, including the brothers who had been at that funeral with their controlled expressions and their measured grief. He wasn't a good man, she wrote. No, that doesn't make it right. No, it doesn't. She looked at those two words for a long time. Why are you telling me the truth? She asked. His reply came immediately, which told her he'd been waiting for the question. Because you've been lied to by everyone who was supposed to be honest with you. Because I decided, early on, that whatever happened between us, that would not be what I was to you. What are you to me? The longest pause of all. I'm working on that, he wrote, if you'll let me. She thought about Marco's voice. There is no man who would dare. She thought about the law and the walls and the shape of her life. Then she thought about a bridge in October and 2 seconds of a look and a man who had said, I know you, in the silence of his own mind, and had apparently meant it. Come to the house, she wrote. Thursday, after midnight. The back door on Via del Cedro. There's a key under the stone cat. My security rotation changes at midnight. You'll have 20 minutes before they complete the circuit. She sent the message before she could reconsider it. Then she sat very still and waited. I'll be there, he wrote. She changed her dress twice. This was not a thing she would have admitted to anyone, and she examined it with a merciless self-awareness that she also wouldn't have admitted to. The dress changing, the hour spent on her hair before deciding that she preferred it down, the glass of wine she poured and then left untouched because she didn't want to arrive at the door of midnight with the blurred edges of alcohol. She was nervous. This was also not a thing she was accustomed to. She had been many things in her life, measured, controlled, watchful, sometimes afraid of specific and practical dangers, but nervous in the way that made her hands uncertain and her breath shallow was new. And she sat with it in the low-lit living room at 11:30 and decided it was information rather than weakness. She was nervous because it mattered. That was the beginning and end of it. At 12 minutes past midnight, there was a sound at the back door. She opened it, and he was there. He looked, and she registered this with the visual acuity of someone who had been thinking about a person for months, different in the smallness of the doorframe than he did against the openness of the river. Not smaller, more present. As though the same concentration of force had been compressed into a narrower frame, and was therefore more visible. He stepped inside, and she closed the door, and they stood in the back hallway of her small Trastevere house, in the silence of past midnight, with the city outside the walls going about its own business, and looked at each other. "Hello," she said, because it was all that existed at the beginning. "Hello," he said. She brought him through to the living room, and he moved through her space with a careful attentiveness, taking it in without comment, with the quality of a person who was noting things about someone in the best possible way, the way you noted things about a person you intended to understand. They sat across from each other, with the table between them and the one lamp making a small, contained world of yellow light. "I've been trying," he said, "to think of something to tell you that would be adequate to this." She looked at him. "Don't try. Just speak." He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been alone for a long time, in the specific way that a man can be surrounded by people and be completely alone. I'd come to think of it as a feature of the work, that the position required a certain isolation, that it was actually useful, that emotional proximity was a vulnerability. I'd built a life on that logic. He looked at his hands, then back at her. And then I saw you on a bridge at dawn, and the entire structure developed a crack. She felt the sentence arrive in her chest. Nero. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, he said. I want to be very clear about that. I know what the obstacles are, I know the law, and I know what Marco will do, and I know the weight of what I represent to your family. I know all of it. I'm not here to pretend it doesn't exist. Then why are you here? He looked at her steadily. Because I wanted to be in a room with you and say something true. And the truest thing I know right now is that I have thought about you with a constancy and a completeness that is incompatible with the idea that this is casual, that you are not— He paused, choosing carefully. You are not a woman I can be interested in from a distance and then put down. I tried that for 4 months. It doesn't work. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and crossed the table and sat beside him on the sofa, close but not touching, and turned toward him with her legs folded under her and her hands in her lap. Tell me something true, she said. I just did. Something else. He looked at her in the lamplight, and what she saw on his face was not the controlled, dangerous composure that the city knew him for. It was something more exposed than that, not vulnerable in a way that asked to be protected, but open in a way that asked to be received. I think you are extraordinary, he said, and I think you have been surrounded by people who could not see that, which is the most pointless tragedy I can imagine. She didn't cry, but something in her chest broke open the way sealed rooms broke open to light, with a sound that was almost structural. You have to go, she said softly. 10 minutes. He stood. She stood with him. They were standing close enough now that the warmth of him was perceptible, a specific heat that registered as significant. He reached up and touched her face again, the same gesture as on the bridge, the same careful precision, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. I'll come back, he said, if you want me to. She turned her face, very slightly, into his hand. Yes, she said. He left through the back door, and she stood in the kitchen in the dark and listened to the sound of the city and felt, at 28 years old, as though something that had been closed for a very long time had been not forced open, nothing so crude, but simply, gently, asked if it wanted to try. Spring brought the tourists back, and with them the particular alchemy of Rome that made danger feel like theatre, and theatre feel like danger. And in the middle of all of it, Fiora and Nero were doing something that had, despite every reasonable objection, become real. He came to the Trastevere house twice more in March, once in April, each time through the back door, each time with a careful attention to the security rotation that told her he had studied it in detail. Not because she'd asked him to, but because protecting her from the consequences of his presence was, apparently, something he considered his obligation. She found this characteristic of him, the way he planned for her safety as though it were a variable he had incorporated into every decision. They talked. This was the thing she would have struggled to explain to anyone who expected the situation to be primarily physical. They talked in the way she had never talked with anyone, the way she had read about in novels and dismissed as idealized, with complete honesty, with humour, with the kind of disagreements that arrived and were resolved without wreckage, with a mutual attention that felt like being held without anyone touching her. Sometimes he touched her. The touches were careful, accumulated slowly, each one its own negotiation. His hand at her waist when she laughed at something and leaned into him. The back of his fingers against her cheek. Once, sitting together with his arm behind her on the back of the sofa, the feeling of his shoulder against hers, like something she had been cold without and hadn't known it. They had not kissed. The not kissing had its own quality, not abstinence, not denial, but something more deliberate, as though they both understood that the kiss would be a crossing that changed the geography, and they were making the territory familiar enough to be worth protecting first. It was Ciro who forced the issue. Ciro Mantovani had been with Nero for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between his employer's moods with the precision of a seismograph. He came to Nero's office on a Wednesday in April with the face of a man carrying something he'd been carrying too long and finally decided to put down. "Someone in Marco Esposito's organization has been asking questions," he said. Nero looked up from the desk. "What kind of questions?" "About the widow. About her security rotation. About whether there have been irregularities in her pattern of movement." A pause. Whoever is asking knows to ask those specific questions. How close are they to an answer? Unclear. But the fact that they know the right questions means someone has already seen something. Nero set down his pen. How long? The questions started appearing last week. A week, which meant whoever was asking had likely already seen something. Perhaps one of his visits, perhaps an approximated version of one, and was verifying rather than investigating from scratch. "Find out who's asking," Nero said, "and tell me how certain they are." After Ciro left, Nero sat for a long time with his hands flat on the desk. He was a man who had built his position on the precise management of risk, on knowing exactly how much of it he was carrying at any given time and whether the potential return justified the exposure. He had applied this calculation to every significant decision of his adult life. He was currently engaged in a situation that by any objective application of that calculation was the most dangerous thing he had done since his first year in Rome, when everything was dangerous because everything was new. The difference was that then the risk had been only his. He messaged her that night. "I need to tell you something," she replied quickly. "Tell me." "Someone in Marco's circle is asking questions about your security. I don't know how much they know yet, but they know enough to ask the right things." A longer pause this time. How much time do I have before it becomes critical? He thought about Ciro's face. Days, possibly, maybe a week. I'm finding out. What do we do? He looked at that question for a long time. There was a version of an answer in which he said, "We stop. We create distance. We let time build a story in which this never happened." There was a version in which he said, "I'll handle it," which was the kind of sentence that could mean many things in his world, most of them permanent. Neither of those answers was what he wanted to give her. "I don't know yet," he wrote, "but I'm not willing to have a solution that involves you being in danger. Everything else is negotiable. That isn't. Nero, let me handle this. Trust me." Another pause. Then, "I do." That's the terrifying part. He found out 3 days later. The person asking questions was not Marco's man at all. It was Aldo, the younger Esposito brother, 37 years old, who had his brother's ambition without Marco's discipline, and who had, Nero's source revealed, been harbouring a particular interest in Fiora for longer than was appropriate. Aldo Esposito wanted the widow for himself. Not from sentiment, Nero had no illusions about that. From the same calculus that had governed her first marriage, she was a De Luca, her family was connected, possessing her was a form of social territory. And the law that forbade her from remarrying could be waived by the family patriarch, which Marco was, which meant Aldo needed only his brother's permission and was apparently moving toward asking for it. Nero sat with this information and felt something he rarely permitted himself, something hot and absolute and very close to rage. Not because the situation threatened his access to Fiora, though it did, but because she had been a piece moved on other men's boards her entire life, and the idea of it continuing, of Aldo Esposito looking at her with that calculation and making that ask, was something his entire body rejected. He told her. "Aldo wants to claim widow's right," he wrote. "He'll go to Marco." He could feel, through the screen, the specific quality of her stillness. "When?" "I don't know. Soon." "And Marco?" "Unknown. He might permit it. Aldo is his brother." A very long pause. "I won't do it," she wrote. "I would rather... I don't know what I would rather do." "But not that." "You won't have to," he wrote. "Nero, don't do anything that... Trust me," he wrote. "I'll handle it without anyone bleeding. That's a promise." She didn't reply immediately. When she did, it was just, "I do trust you. Please be careful." He put his phone in his pocket and called Ciro and told him what he needed, and Ciro looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular escalation for some time. "You understand what you're declaring," Ciro said. "I understand exactly what I'm declaring," Nero said. What Nero declared was this: that the Esposito family's claim on Fiora would be contested. He did not declare it with violence. He declared it the way the most dangerous men declare the most important things, through the precise application of leverage, in a room, over coffee, with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. He requested a meeting with Marco Esposito. The request itself was an act of audacity that sent its own signal. Marco received it through the appropriate channels, which told Nero that his people were watching the channels closely, which told him that the questions Ciro had identified were probably Marco's, not Aldo's, that Marco had been aware of Nero's movements toward Fiora and had been deciding what to do about it. They met at a restaurant in Prati on a Thursday afternoon, early enough that the lunch crowd had gone and the dinner crowd had not yet arrived. Marco brought 2 men. Nero brought Ciro. The remaining staff had been made to understand that privacy was valued. Marco was already seated when Nero arrived. He watched Nero cross the room with an expression that balanced between professional assessment and personal affront, the expression of a man who was simultaneously impressed and insulted by the audacity in front of him. Falcone, he said. Marco. Nero sat. Thank you for seeing me. I almost didn't. I know. I appreciate the restraint. Marco poured himself a glass of water, deliberate, studying Nero over the rim. You have something to say? I do. Nero kept his voice level, his hands still on the table. I'm going to be direct with you, because I think you respect directness more than circumspection. Try me. I'm interested in Fiora. I intend to pursue that interest. I'm telling you this rather than allowing you to discover it, because I believe the conversation is better had this way. The silence that followed was the kind that tested rooms. Marco set his glass down with a precision that communicated controlled force. You understand what you're saying? Completely. The law, I'm aware of the law. I'm not asking you to change it today. I'm asking you to consider something. Falcone, Aldo wants her, Nero said. The directness of it landed like a stone. You know that, and I know that. Ask yourself which of those outcomes serves Fiora better. Ask yourself, if you're capable of it, which one she would choose. Marco's expression shifted in a way that was hard to read, something moving behind the controlled surface that was either fury or, improbably, genuine consideration. She doesn't choose, Marco said. That's not how this works. It's how it should work, Nero said. And I think, on some level, you know that. You're asking me to break family law for... I'm asking you to not enforce it against her will. Nero paused. Those are different things. You have discretion here, Marco. You know you do. They sat for a long moment in the empty restaurant. If I allowed this, Marco said, carefully, slowly, as though each word was a step on uncertain ground. There are members of the family who would view it as weakness, as my authority being, I know, Nero said, and I'm prepared to make that cost worth bearing. What are you offering? The Romano street trade on the Ostiense corridor. It's mine, for now. You've wanted it for 2 years. A pause. And a formal agreement of non-interference between our operations for 5 years, with binding terms. Marco's eyes changed. Nero had done the calculation carefully. The Ostiense corridor was valuable, but not irreplaceable for him. He had 3 other revenue streams of comparable size. For Marco, newly installed as patriarch and in need of a victory, it was significant. Significant enough to justify the optics of a deviation from family law, framed correctly. And if I refuse, Marco said, then I pursue this differently, Nero said. And we both understand what differently means, and neither of us wants that. It was not a threat of violence, it was a threat of escalation, of territory wars, of proxy battles, of the long attrition of 2 organizations in direct conflict. Marco was newly in charge. He did not need a war, he needed consolidation. Marco sat back. He looked at Nero with the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered and was deciding whether to be angry about it. You're serious about her, he said. It didn't sound like a question. I'm serious about her, Nero confirmed. Another long silence. I'll speak to the family, Marco said. I'm not making you any guarantees, and Aldo is going to be a problem. I'll manage Aldo, Nero said. If you manage him with anything other than words, the deal is off. Words, Nero agreed. They stood and shook hands in the empty restaurant, and Nero walked out into the Prati afternoon and called Ciro and told him to prepare the transfer documentation for the Ostiense corridor, and then he called a number he knew by heart. She picked up on the second ring. "Nero?" "I spoke to Marco." A sharp intake of breath. "What did you—" "I offered him the Ostiense trade route. He's considering it. He'll speak to the family." A pause. "He didn't say no, Fiora. That matters." Her silence was the silence of a woman working through something very large. "You gave up a trade route," she said finally. "Yes. For me. Yes." Another silence, different in quality. "You shouldn't have." "I wanted to." He was walking now, past the plane trees on the Lungo Tevere, the Tiber visible between the buildings. "I want to. This is not something I did for leverage or strategy. I want you to understand that." "I do understand it," she said softly. "That's why I don't know what to do with it." "You don't have to do anything with it yet," he said. "Let me handle the family. Let it settle. Just—" He paused. "Just know that I'm not doing this because it's easy. I'm doing it because you are worth every complicated thing it costs." She was quiet for so long, he thought perhaps the call had dropped. Then, "No one has ever—" She stopped, started again. "Come on Sunday." "I'll be there," he said. Aldo Esposito was not a man who accepted outcomes gracefully. He had grown up the youngest of three brothers in a family where position was earned through performance, and the performance he had given over 37 years was the performance of a man who understood the prize but struggled with the patience required to win it legitimately. He was smart enough to know when he was losing, and not disciplined enough to lose without making someone else pay for it. When Marco came to him with the offer, the Ostiense corridor, the non-interference agreement, the information that the widow's law was being reconsidered, Aldo said nothing in the room. He sat with his face arranged into the expression of a man receiving information, and waited until he was alone. Then he did the thing that impulsive men do when they understand that the legitimate path has closed. He found an illegitimate one. He didn't go to Marco. He went outside the family. The Romano organization had reasons to be interested in a destabilized relationship between the Falcone operation and the Espositos. Romano's territory had been squeezed for 2 years by Nero's southward expansion. The idea of those two powers in conflict, of resources being redirected from territorial pressure to internal fire, was commercially appealing. Aldo met with a Romano intermediary on a Friday night and told them what he knew. That Nero Falcone had been meeting with Fiora Esposito in her Trastevere home. That the visits had been covert. That the relationship had a specific texture that went beyond casual. He told them this not because he was loyal to the Romanos, but because he wanted it known, wanted it spread, wanted it to arrive in the right ears before Marco's deal could be formalized. He wanted Nero Falcone humiliated. He wanted Fiora made a problem that Marco would be forced to contain. He did not consider the possibility that Nero's intelligence network was better than his. By Saturday morning, Ciro had a report. By Saturday afternoon, Nero knew the precise nature of what Aldo had done and who he had told it to. Nero sat in his office on the Lungo Tevere and worked through the implications with the cold efficiency of a man who had been navigating hostile situations for 20 years. The Romano organization having the information was manageable. They were strategic actors. They would use it as leverage rather than broadcast it, because broadcasting it cost them a chip they could otherwise trade. The more immediate problem was that Aldo had moved against Fiora, and that was a line that Nero found he was not willing to let pass without consequence. He called Marco directly, not through intermediaries, directly. "Your brother went to the Romanos," he said when Marco picked up. The silence was complete. "Tell me what you know," Marco said, very quietly. Nero told him, all of it. The intermediary, the content of what Aldo had disclosed, the timing relative to Marco's own deliberations. He laid it out with the precision of a document, without editorializing, because the facts were damning enough without commentary. When he finished, Marco said, "Give me 24 hours. "You have it," Nero said. "But Marco, if anything comes toward Fiora as a result of what Aldo told the Romanos—" "I understand," Marco said. "Give me 24 hours. Nero hung up and called Fiora. She answered immediately. "I heard your voice in my chest just now," she said, which was the most unguarded thing she had said to him, and he registered it with the precision of someone cataloguing things of value. "Something has happened," he said. "I need you to not be alone tonight." A beat. "Tell me." He told her. He watched himself as he did it, for the instinct to soften it, to manage her reception of it, and found that instinct absent or overridden by the commitment he had made in his own mind to be honest with her above everything else. "Aldo," she said when he finished. A word that was not quite a curse, but carried the weight of one. "Yes." "What will Marco do?" "Handle it. He has no choice. Aldo went outside the family without authorization, which is—" He paused. "That's not forgiven easily." "Is he in danger?" He was quiet for a moment. "Marco won't hurt his own brother." "You didn't answer my question." "No," he said, "but his position in the family is over. He won't recover from this." She was quiet. He could feel her processing it, the layers of it, the family politics, the personal betrayal, the specific, particular misery of being the prize in other men's games. "I want to see you," she said. "Tonight isn't safe. Tomorrow. Can you arrange?" "Yes. I'll manage the detail. Come at midnight." He came. She opened the door and looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on with the particular grip of someone who had been frightened and was now somewhere safer. He held her back, his hands against her back, her head against his shoulder, the warmth of her an entire argument against every obstacle he had been managing for months. "You're safe," he said, very quietly, into her hair. "I know," she said. "You make me feel that way." They stood like that for a long time in the back hallway of her Trastevere house, with the city outside the walls and the lamp in the kitchen making its small, warm light. And Nero thought, with a clarity that was itself a kind of peace, that there was nothing he would not do to keep this. Marco called on a Tuesday. Fiora was in her garden, and she heard her phone ring and saw the name and felt the immediate tightening in her chest that his calls always produced, the anticipation of constraint, of management, of being reminded of the shape of her own life. She answered. "I've spoken to the family," Marco said. She waited. "Aldo has been removed from a position of influence." A careful pause. "He made choices that were not sanctioned. Those choices have been addressed. I understand. The matter of Falcone. A longer pause. The family law regarding the widow has been in place for 40 years. It exists for reasons that I believe in. You know this. Yes. And I will not pretend that suspending it is uncomplicated. There are people who will see it as a precedent, as an erosion. I understand that too, she said. What I'm prepared to say, Marco said, with the deliberateness of a man measuring each word for structural integrity, is that the family's objection to your association with Falcone will not be enforced actively. I cannot give you my blessing, not publicly, but I can look elsewhere. She stood in her garden in the April light and understood what he was telling her. Not permission, not blessing. A door left slightly ajar, deliberately, with plausible deniability built into every hinge. Is that enough? Marco asked, and she heard in the question something she hadn't expected. Something almost like worry, as though the hard surface of him had a small crack through which something human was briefly visible. Yes, she said. That's enough. A beat. He gave up real value for you, Marco said. It was not disapproval exactly, it was the observation of a man who dealt in value and recognized its weight. The Ostiense corridor is not nothing. He could have threatened or positioned. He didn't. I know. That means something in this world. It does, she said. Another pause, different in quality, less official, more human. Salvatore didn't deserve you, Marco said. It came out as though he'd been holding it for a long time and had decided in this moment to put it down. I know that's not something I'm supposed to say, but it's true, and I am sorry that I didn't say it sooner. She stood very still. Marco. I'm not sentimental, he said quickly. I don't want to make this... He cleared his throat. You are family. That remains true regardless of what arrangements change. I know, she said softly. Thank you. He hung up, and she stood in the garden with the phone warm in her hand and the April light on her face, and felt the particular sensation of a wall coming down that she had believed was permanent. She called Nero. He picked up in 2 rings, which she had learned meant he'd been waiting. Marco called, she said. I know, he called me first, 30 minutes ago. He said, I know what he said. Are you all right? She thought about this. The specific question of whether she was all right applied to this specific moment. I think I'm better than all right, she said. A pause. Then his voice shifted, something warming through it, the controlled surface moving aside enough to show what lived underneath. Good, he said. I have something I'd like to ask you. Ask. Will you have dinner with me? Not a river walk, not midnight through the back door. A proper dinner, somewhere in this city, at a table. Visible. She closed her eyes. Visible. The word carried so much. The end of the back door, the end of midnight, the end of the specific, careful secrecy that had shaped the last 5 months of her life. Where? She asked. I know a place on the Janiculum. The view is worth the risk of being seen. We're not a risk any more, she said. No, he agreed. We're not. She felt something in her chest that she recognized finally by its proper name. Not hope, exactly. Something more committed than hope. Something that had survived 5 months of obstacles and deliberately managed risk, and the particular endurance test of wanting something you could not have and choosing it anyway. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. "I'll pick you up. The front door." The front door. She smiled, standing in her garden in the April light. "The front door," she said. He arrived at 7:30. Fiora had opened the front door before he reached it, which was not the image she had intended to present, but was entirely honest. She had been at the window for 20 minutes, which was information about herself that she accepted with something approaching amusement. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open, in the way she had seen on the one night he'd been in her living room, and which she had apparently filed in her memory with archival precision. He was carrying nothing, no flowers, no gift, nothing performative, and he looked at her when she opened the door with the same directness she had learned to live inside, to find bearable, and then to find necessary. "You look—" He stopped. "What?" "Like yourself," he said, fully. She understood what he meant. She was wearing a dress she had chosen because she wanted to wear it, red wine dark, with her hair down. She had not consulted anyone's expectations. She had chosen with the simple authority of a woman dressing for herself and no one else. "Come in for a moment," she said. He came in, and she got her coat, and he stood in her living room in the lamplight and looked at the space with the same careful attention he always brought to things he was memorizing. "I like it here," he said. "I like it too," she said. "It's the first home that's actually felt like mine." "Because you chose it?" "Because I chose it," she confirmed. The restaurant on the Janiculum was everything he had implied. Small, elevated, with the kind of view over Rome that made the city look like its own dream. They were seated on the terrace with the lights spread below them and the April air warm enough that she didn't need the coat, and a sommelier who understood by some professional sixth sense that this was a table for someone who wanted to be left alone between courses. The food was extraordinary. She barely noticed it. What she noticed was the conversation, which was different in public than in the dark intimacy of the house or the open air of the river. Not more or less honest, but visible in a different way. When they laughed at something, she could see the way it changed his face. When he was thoughtful, she could watch the specific quality of his attention. When he looked at her across the table, she could see how he looked at her without any mediation, without the filtered quality of screens or the managed quality of careful meetings. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. This was not arrogance, she understood. It was not performance. It was, and the word arrived with a certainty that surprised her, devotion. A specific, chosen, completely unambivalent attention that was the opposite of everything she had experienced in 6 years of marriage, and that felt, in its simplicity, revolutionary. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That you look at me like you decided to," she said. He considered this. "Yes," he said. "That's accurate. Most people don't decide. They look or they don't." "I decided," he said, "on a bridge in October. I decided that I was going to know you if it was possible to know you, and that whatever the cost was, it was worth paying." A pause. It has cost more than I initially calculated. I don't regret any of it. She looked at him across the table with the lights of Rome below them. I have never... She stopped, started again. I have spent my adult life being in relation to the people around me. Daughter, wife, widow. I have never been... She found the word. Adjacent to someone like this, where I exist in my own right and you exist in your own right, and the thing between us is chosen by both of us with complete information. She paused. It's terrifying, and it's the most alive I have felt in years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. Not a gesture, an arrival. His hand closing around hers with the certainty of something that had been waiting to happen for a long time. I know, he said. I feel that too. They sat like that, with the city below them, and his hand around hers, and the wine going warm in the glasses, and she thought about the bridge, and the text message, and the Sunday mornings, and the 20 minutes, and the back door, and Marco's voice saying, "Look elsewhere," and the whole architecture of it, the months of careful building, the obstacles and the navigation and the cost, arrived in her chest as something that had a shape she finally recognized. She was in love with him. She had known this for weeks. But here, at this table, with his hand in hers, and Rome below, and the night around them, the knowing became something she didn't need to keep examining for hidden dangers. It was simply true. "Nero," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I know what you feel," he said, "because I feel it too, and I have for longer than is probably dignified to admit." She smiled, and it was not a managed smile, not a performed one. It was the full face kind she had been conserving for years. "How long?" she asked. "Since the bridge," he said. "Before the bridge, possibly. There were 4 times I saw you. I counted them." "You counted them?" "Obsessively," he said, and the word, said with that flat precision, made her laugh, a real one, warm and startled, and she saw the expression it produced on his face, something that was almost wonder, watching her laugh, the way you watched something beautiful that you hadn't expected to be allowed to see. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was careful and old-fashioned and entirely genuine, and she felt it in her chest like the first note of something that was going to last. She invited him in when they returned. He came through the front door in the open night, the security men aware and not interfering, and she took his coat, and he stood in her living room and looked at her with the expression she was beginning to map as carefully as she mapped the city. "Stay," she said, not as a demand, as an offering. He looked at her for a moment, not hesitating exactly, but fully inhabiting the moment before everything changed. "You're certain?" he said. "I have been certain for months," she said. "I've been waiting for the world to catch up." He came to her then, crossing the room in the way he moved through his own club, with a certainty that was not arrogance, but something more fundamental, the certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was going. He came to her and put his hands on her face and looked at her for one last moment of the before. "I have been wanting to do this," he said, "since a bridge in October." "Then stop waiting," she said. He kissed her, not gently, not tentatively. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete attention, with intention, with a thoroughness that left nothing unconsidered. His hands moved from her face to her hair, and she reached up and held on to the lapels of his jacket and kissed him back, with 6 months of accumulated wanting, with everything she had been managing and containing and carefully not naming. The kiss lasted a long time. When it ended, he pressed his forehead against hers, and they both stood in the living room, breathing in the same air, and the city was quiet outside the walls. "Finally," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and warm, something she hadn't heard from him before, unguarded, real. "Yes," he said, "finally." Later, much later, they were sitting on the sofa with her legs folded over his lap and his hand at her ankle, and the lamp making its small circle of light, and the conversation was looser, warmer, more candid than it had ever been, the particular openness of people who have crossed a threshold and found the other side habitable. "What happens now?" she asked. "We figure it out," he said. "Together. Marco will maintain a degree of official neutrality, but the family will know." "The family already knows," he said. "Ciro confirmed it today. The consensus is divided between people who think it's a disaster and people who think the trade-off is acceptable." "And the Romanos?" "The Romanos have the information Aldo gave them. They'll use it eventually, as leverage or as noise." He paused. "I'm prepared for that." "What does prepared mean?" "It means I have 3 moves already planned," he said, "and that none of those moves requires you to be involved in anything other than continuing to live your life." She looked at him. "I don't want to be protected from the realities of your world." "I know." He met her eyes. "I'm not trying to protect you from reality. I'm trying to protect you from the specific kind of danger that comes from being near me when the dangerous parts happen." A pause. "Those are different things. The way you protected me from Aldo, the way I protected you from Aldo," he agreed. She thought about this, about the specific quality of being protected by someone who understood the distinction, who did not confuse protecting her from danger with protecting her from knowledge, who did not mistake care for control. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was afraid," she said, "for a long time, of wanting this, of letting myself want you specifically, because wanting something this disallowed felt, I don't know, destructive, self-defeating." She looked at him steadily. "I spent 6 years learning not to want things. And then you happened. And the wanting was so specific and so clear and so entirely incompatible with the life I was supposed to be living that I spent 5 months telling myself it would go nowhere and coming back to the river anyway." He was watching her with that complete attention. "I know," he said quietly. "What do you know?" "I know that it cost you to be here," he said. "I know that every time you opened the back door and I came in, you were making a choice that your whole life had been structured to prevent. I know that, and I'm—" He paused. The pause was full of something he was working toward. "I'm honored by it." "That sounds—" "No," she said, "it doesn't." He looked at her. "I don't use words carelessly," he said. "Honored is the right word. That you would choose this, knowing all of it. That's not a small thing." She reached up and put her hand against his cheek, the mirroring of his gesture on the bridge, on the sofa, all those careful weeks ago. "Neither are you," she said. The Romanos moved in May, as Nero had predicted they would. They moved not with violence. The Romano organization was too commercially sophisticated for direct action when information could achieve the same result more cheaply, but with disclosure. A carefully orchestrated leak to 3 senior members of the Esposito family below Marco's level, containing the specifics of what Aldo had told them, the visits, the pattern of movement, the nature of the relationship. The calculation was elegant in its way. If Marco had already decided to look aside, these members had not. Their response would create pressure. The pressure would force Marco to either enforce the law, which would mean reversing his implicit permission and likely triggering a confrontation with Nero, or publicly defend his decision, which would expose him to internal criticism. It was the Romano organization being Romano, finding the crack in the wall and applying pressure precisely there. Nero's response was characteristically several steps ahead. He had anticipated this particular move because he had anticipated the Romano organization's logic. Their calculation assumed that Marco, under family pressure, would choose the path of least resistance, which was enforcement of the law. What they had not accounted for was that Nero had spent 3 months building a file on 3 of those same senior Esposito members, documenting financial irregularities that were entirely plausible and entirely traceable, and which Marco, once presented with them, would find considerably more interesting than enforcing the widow's law. The file was not fabricated. This was important to Nero, not from a moral position exactly, but from a practical one. Fabricated evidence had a way of unraveling, and he didn't want the thing that protected Fiora to be something with a shelf life. He had found the irregularities because they existed, because men in positions of power often assumed their position was also a shield, and assumed wrong. He sent the file to Marco through an intermediary on a Monday morning. Marco called him by noon. "You've been thorough," Marco said. His voice was carefully neutral, which Nero had learned to read as meaning he was significantly less calm underneath. "I had time," Nero said. "These 3 men are going to be a problem." "I imagine so. I'd suggest the problem is better managed from a position of strength." A pause. "You're telling me how to run my family?" "I'm telling you that the tool in your hand is more useful than the tool in theirs," Nero said. "What you do with that is entirely your business." Another pause. "The leak. Romano." "Yes. They want us at each other's throats." "They do," Nero agreed. "The question is whether we give them that." The silence that followed was the kind in which decisions were being made. "No," Marco said finally. "We don't." He called Fiora immediately after. "It's handled," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The leak?" "Yes, Marco is dealing with the family members. The Romanos have been," he chose the word carefully, "discouraged from further involvement." "How discouraged?" "Commercially," he said. "I had something they wanted. I made its availability conditional on their non-interference. No one bled." He heard her exhale. "You said no one would bleed." "I keep my promises." A longer quiet. "Nero," she said, "what you've done, the file, the trade route, all of it, you've been—" She paused. "You've reorganized significant parts of your operation around protecting me." "Yes." "That's proportionate," he said, "to what I feel." The word proportionate, said with that flat Roman directness, without decoration, hit her the way his most honest statements always did, squarely in the centre. "Come tonight," she said. "I wasn't planning on being anywhere else," he said. He arrived at 9, and she had cooked, which surprised him, a real meal at the kitchen table, with wine and the kind of ordinary domesticity that felt, in the context of everything the last months had been, almost impossibly good. They ate and talked and argued about a film they had both seen at different times and reached no conclusion and did not need one. She refilled his glass without being asked. He noticed she had reorganized the books on the shelf in the hall to make room for a volume of his that he'd left behind 2 weeks ago. And this small thing, the integration of his book into her shelf, registered in his chest with a significance he didn't try to reduce. Later, she fell asleep on the sofa with her head against his shoulder, and he sat awake in the low light of her living room, with the weight and warmth of her against his side, and the city going dark outside, and thought, with a precision that was new, about the future. He had not thought about the future in any personal sense for a long time. The professional future, always. Plans, strategies, the 3-move calculations. But the personal, the domestic, the ordinary human question of what you wanted the rest of your life to look like, that had been absent or suspended, or simply deferred by the absence of anyone who made the question feel worth asking. He thought about it now. He thought about it with her breath against his shoulder and her hand relaxed in his, and the lamp making its small circle around them. He knew exactly what he wanted. He was, for the first time in 20 years, entirely certain. June came in on a wave of heat, the city settling into its summer self, louder, more fragrant, the afternoons heavy with warmth that bounced off the stone and made the evenings feel earned. They had been visible for a month. Not loudly, not provocatively. They were not people who performed their private lives, but visible in the small ways that mattered. His car outside her house in the evenings, the two of them seen at a restaurant in Trastevere, at a private gathering in Parioli, where the assembled company had understood immediately and had responded with the pragmatic adaptation of people who respected power in all its forms. Marco had not been present. Marco had been, in the manner he had promised, looking elsewhere. Aldo had left Rome. She did not know where, and found that she cared less than she had expected. Her father called. "I hear things," Enzo said, in the careful voice. "What do you hear?" "That Nero Falcone has been spending significant time in Trastevere." A pause. "I hear it from 3 separate sources, which suggests it is no longer a private matter." "It was never fully private," she said. "We were just careful." "And now you're less careful." "And now we're less careful," she agreed. A long silence. She heard her father breathing, heard him working through something. "Is he good to you?" Enzo said finally. And the simplicity of the question, stripped of all the political and organizational context, reduced to its most fundamental form, made her throat tighten. "Yes," she said. "Exceptionally." Then he stopped, started again. "I made a mistake with Salvatore. I chose the alliance over the person. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since." A pause. "I am not making that mistake again." "Papa." "I trust your judgment," he said, "more than I have trusted mine in these matters. Go and live, Fiora. That's all I'm saying. Go and live." She cried a little after she hung up, sitting in her garden with the morning light on her face, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of being released from a grief she had been carrying so long She'd stopped noticing its weight. She texted Nero. "My father called. He's given his blessing, essentially." The reply was immediate. "I know. I called him last week." She stared at this. "You called my father?" "I thought he deserved to hear it from me directly. What I intend. What you mean to me." She put the phone down and pressed her hands to her face and breathed. He had called her father. He had told him what she meant to him. He had done it without telling her, which was either presumptuous or, she felt the word arrive, tender, in the way that actions taken in consideration of your feelings before you knew to ask for them were tender. "What exactly did you tell him?" she wrote. A pause. "That I love you, that I intend to be with you, that I will not embarrass you or harm you or make you feel like furniture in anyone's house for as long as I'm breathing." She read this 5 times. She was sitting in her garden in the June morning, with the roses coming into bloom, and the city murmuring over the walls, and a message on her phone that contained the word love, deployed with the same deliberateness with which Nero Falcone deployed every significant word he had ever spoken to her. "Come tonight," she wrote. He came. They had dinner on the terrace of his penthouse on the Lungotevere. She had been there twice before, and each time the view undid her a little, the way Rome at night undid people who loved it. The city spread below in its ancient amber light, the Tiber curving dark and silver between its banks, the dome of St. Peter's, a pale dome, against the velvet sky. After dinner, he was quiet in a way she recognized as something being prepared. "What?" she said. He turned to her. They were standing at the railing with the city below, and he was looking at her in the direct way he had first looked at her on a bridge 8 months ago, the way that had started all of this. "I told your father what I intend," he said. "I want to tell you." "Tell me." "I intend to marry you," he said. "Not immediately, not before the timing is right, before the political ground has settled, before you have had enough time to be certain of what you want. I'm not asking you to decide tonight." He paused. "I'm asking you to know that it's where I want to go. That when I said I love you to your father, I meant it as information about my plans, not just my feelings." She looked at him for a long moment. "When you decided on the bridge," she said, "in October, you decided what, exactly?" "I decided that I wasn't going to pretend I could walk away from whatever you were," he said, "and that whatever it cost, I was going to find a way toward you. I didn't know what the way was. I knew it existed." "You knew before Salvatore died?" "Yes." "You would have. I would have waited," he said, "as long as was necessary. I'm not a patient man, generally. With you, I have found an unlimited supply of it." She stepped toward him, and he didn't move. Let her close the distance. Let her come to him with the same intention with which she did everything now. Her own, chosen, unambivalent. She put her hands on his face, the way he had put his hands on hers that first time, on a February morning, by the river. "I love you," she said. The words came out clearly, without ornament, the way true things came out when they had been acknowledged for long enough. He closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 second of something that was not composure at all, something that was simply the receipt of what he had wanted for longer than he had known how to want things. Then he opened them and looked at her. "I know," he said. "I've known for months." "Arrogant," she said. "Attentive," he corrected, and she laughed, and he kissed her, and Rome spread below them in its ancient, indifferent magnificence, entirely unconcerned with the small, enormous human drama at its railing. It was Ciro who brought the information in July, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, with the face of a man who had debated for some hours whether to come at all, and had decided that not coming was worse. He came to the penthouse and stood in the living room, with his hands behind his back and his expression configured for the delivery of difficult truths. Nero, who had been reading, put the book down and looked at him with the specific attention he gave things that his most trusted person considered worth interrupting his evening to say. "Tell me," Nero said. "Salvatore Esposito," Ciro said. "The shooting outside the Borghese." Nero waited. "We've known for 9 months that it wasn't Romano. We established that early." Ciro paused. "We also established, at the time, that the method was consistent with a particular contractor, a man named Vella, who works out of Milan, and whose style is distinctive. 3 bullets, professional placement, no witnesses." "Vella," Nero said. He knew the name. Most people of consequence in the Italian underworld knew the name. "Vella was contracted through an intermediary. We identified the intermediary 6 weeks ago, a man called Gatti, who does business in Naples and occasionally Rome." Ciro paused again, and Nero understood from the quality of the pause that what was coming was the part Ciro had debated. "The contract went through Gatti," Ciro said. "The money came from a De Luca account, a secondary account, obscured, but traceable if you know what to look for." The silence was complete. "Enzo De Luca," Nero said. "Yes." Nero sat very still for a long moment. Fiora's father had arranged the death of her husband. He worked through the implications with the cold, analytical intelligence that had served him for 20 years, and what he found was not the calculation he would have expected. He would have expected to think about what to do with the information, how it changed the landscape of power, what it meant for his relationships with the De Luca family, what leverage it represented. Instead, he thought about Fiora, about the conversation she had described with her father, the apology, the admission that choosing Salvatore over her had been a mistake, the instruction to go and live. About the phone call where Enzo had said, "I trusted your judgment." About the flowers her father had brought to lunch, awkwardly, as though someone had advised him to bring them. Enzo De Luca had killed Salvatore Esposito and then handed his daughter to his grief and told her to go and live. He could not tell her. Or he could tell her and watch something in her that was beginning to heal be opened back up and made worse. He could protect her from it, which was the kind of protection she had told him she didn't want. The protection that came with managed ignorance, the protection that was actually a cage. He had promised her honesty above everything else. He called Ciro back an hour later. "Sit on it," he said. "Don't act on it. Don't let it move." "You're not—" "I need to think about how this is handled," Nero said, "and I need to speak to Fiora first." He went to the Trastevere house the following evening. She knew, from the moment she saw his face, that something had shifted. She was learning to read him with a precision that continually surprised both of them. She had said once that it was because she had spent 6 years in a marriage that required reading subtext at high speed, and had developed a skill set she'd rather not have needed. "Tell me," she said, before he could find the opening. He told her. He told her the way he told her everything difficult, completely, without managing her response in advance, trusting her to receive it on her own terms. He told her about Vella and Gatti and the De Luca account, and what it meant. He watched her face as he told her, and what he saw there was not simple shock. It was something more complex, the expression of a person receiving information that clicks into place rather than colliding with existing understanding. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I suspected," she said. He looked at her. "Not specifically, not Vela, not the contract, but my father, in the weeks after." She was looking at her hands. "He came to me, and he brought flowers, and he apologized in that way he has, when the apology isn't really for the thing he's apologizing for." And he was relieved. Underneath the grief and the care, he was relieved. I noticed it, and I put it somewhere I didn't look. She looked up. "I didn't want it to be true." "And now?" She was quiet. "I think he did it because he loved me," she said, "in the way that men in this world love, incompletely, badly, by removing the obstacle rather than by asking if they could help their daughter bear it." She paused. "That doesn't make it right. It doesn't make Salvatore's death something I can be glad about." "No," Nero said carefully, "but I can understand it." She looked at him. "My father thought he was setting me free." "He was," Nero said, "however wrong the method." She nodded slowly. She was working through it, and he let her work through it. Didn't rush her to a resolution, didn't offer her a cleaner version. This was the territory they lived in. These were the walls of the world they both inhabited. "What do you do with it?" she asked. "Professionally." "Nothing," he said. "It goes nowhere. What serves us, what serves you, is that it disappears. Because if it came out, it would remake every relationship in both our families." He paused. "And your father would be in danger." She looked at him for a long moment. "You'd protect him. For me." "I would protect everyone who matters to you," he said. "Yes. For you." She stood and came to him and sat beside him and put her head on his shoulder in the way that he had come to recognize as the specific gesture of her trusting him entirely. Not dramatically, not with words, but with the simple weight of her. "It stays buried," she said. "It stays buried," he agreed. "Nero." "Yes." "Thank you for telling me. I told you I would never lie to you. I know." A pause. "That's why I love you." He put his arm around her and held on. They married in September, not in a church. The church would have required announcements and official ceremonies and the kind of visibility that still carried risk in the wrong directions. They married at his penthouse on the Lungo Tevere in the evening, with the city spread below them in its amber permanence, witnessed by 12 people who mattered. Ciro, with his saint's face and uncharacteristic smile, Valentina, who cried as promised, Enzo De Luca, who stood very straight and pressed Fiora's hand for a long time before he gave her away, and whom Nero treated with a courtesy that was its own form of knowledge, of acceptance, of the specific grace that came from understanding people completely and choosing them anyway. Marco Esposito was not present. Marco had sent instead a bottle of Barolo from a vintage so old it was almost mythological, with a card that said, in his blunt, precise handwriting, "The family acknowledges this union. May it be better than the last," which was, from Marco Esposito, the warmth equivalent of a standing ovation. Fiora wore ivory, not white. She was too old and too clear-eyed for white's particular symbolism. The dress was simple and cut exactly right, and she wore her hair down the way she had started wearing it since October, since the city had begun to feel like it belonged to her rather than the other way around. She was 29 years old. She had been a daughter, a wife, a widow. She was making a fourth thing of herself now, and the fourth thing was the first one she had made with her own hands. The ceremony was brief. The vows they had written themselves, sitting at her kitchen table one evening in August, with the windows open and the sounds of Trastevere coming in from outside, arguing pleasantly about the precise wording of certain commitments. She had wanted to include something about honesty. He had wanted to include something about patience. They had ended up with a version that contained both, along with a line about orchards, a reference to something she had said in the early months on one of their Sunday mornings about how she had always wanted a property with an orchard, and which he had remembered with the completeness of a man who stored everything about her as though it were significant. When the officiant said his part, and it was their turn, Nero looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, directly, without performance, as though she were a fact of the world he had decided to accept in full, and said his vows in the quiet, unhurried voice that she had come to understand was his most honest one. She said hers, looking back at him. When it was done, the 12 people arranged themselves into a celebration, and the wine was poured, and the city below went about its ancient business, and Nero stood on the terrace with his wife. His wife. A phrase that was going to require several months to fully inhabit, and looked at Rome in September. "How does it feel?" she asked, standing beside him. "Like something I didn't dare plan for," he said, "and planned for anyway." She took his hand. "I've been thinking," she said. "Tell me. About what I want." She looked at him. "Not in the way I used to think about it, as this forbidden, private thing, this list of things that would never happen. Actually wanting. As a practice." She paused. "I want to work. I studied 2 years of art history before my father made me stop. I want to go back to it." "Then go back," he said. "It would mean being out of the house, being visible in a professional context. It might—" "Fiora," he turned toward her, "you will do what you want to do. I'm not your previous life. I'm not going to manage your choices or contain your ambitions or make you feel like architecture. That's not what this is." She looked at him for a long moment. "You say things like that," she said, "and I still feel surprised by them. After everything." "You'll get used to it," he said. "I'm not sure I want to," she said. "I think I want to keep being surprised. I think that's better." He looked at her. That look, the direct one, the one he had deployed since a bridge in October, and in it she read, as she always read, "I see you. I chose this. I'm not going anywhere." "Dance with me," he said. Inside, through the glass doors, music was playing. Valentina had found something appropriate, something slow and Roman and golden. 12 people were talking and laughing in the warm light. Fiora laughed. "Here, on the terrace." "Rome is watching," he said. "Let it watch." She laughed again and turned, and he put his arm around her waist and took her other hand, and they danced on the terrace in September, with the city below and the evening sky going from amber to violet above the dome of St. Peter's. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "Nero," she said. "Yes." I need you to know something. Tell me. She pulled back enough to look at him, and what she saw was what she had seen since October. Complete, chosen, unambivalent attention. A man who had decided on a bridge in the early morning that she existed, and that the fact of her existence mattered to him absolutely. Who had built a way toward her through obstacles that most men would have used as reasons to turn back. Who had traded territory and protected fathers and sat on buried secrets and kept every promise he had made her, including the hardest one, the promise to see her. You did it, she said. Did what? You showed me that I was visible. She paused. That I left a mark. He stopped dancing, or didn't stop exactly, moved slower, his hand at the small of her back, pressing her slightly closer, his forehead dropping to hers, in the gesture she recognized as his most private form of tenderness. You have always left a mark, he said. Everyone who couldn't see that was blind. Or not looking. I looked, he said. I have never looked at anything else since the first time. She tilted her head up and kissed him, briefly, tenderly, with the accumulated weight of a bridge and a back door and 20 Sunday mornings and a text message that had arrived in November and changed the shape of her life. Below them, Rome continued its ancient, indifferent business. Above them, the first stars arrived in the September sky. Inside, through the glass doors, their 12 people raised their glasses. Fiora Falcone, the name so new it was still a doorway she was stepping through, stood on her terrace in her city, with her husband's arms around her, and thought about how the law of the dead had tried to hold her, and how the living had won. She thought about her mother's garden in EUR, and the small apartment in Florence she had wanted at 18, and the art history degree she was going to finish now, and the orchard she was going to ask about at the right moment. She thought about windows and rivers and bridges and dawn. She thought, I am here. I am still here, and that is enough, and it is also everything. The night came down over Rome. The city held them, as it had always held everyone who had ever loved anything within its ancient walls, imperfectly, indifferently, and with a permanence that outlasted every obstacle. Enough, she thought. More than enough. They found the orchard in January, on a property outside Frascati, 40 minutes from Rome, on a hill that looked back toward the city with the proprietary confidence of things that had been there longer. The house was old and needed work. It had 12 rooms, 2 fireplaces that functioned and 3 that didn't, a cellar full of wine from a previous owner who had apparently planned for a siege, and an orchard of 40 olive trees that ran down the hillside in 2 lines, like a procession of something patient and permanent. Fiora stood in the orchard in the January cold, with her hands in her pockets, and looked at the trees. Nero stood beside her. Well, he said. She looked at the trees, and at the cold blue sky, and at the line of Rome on the horizon, ancient and enormous, and entirely unconcerned. Yes, she said. He nodded once. They walked back up the hill together through the January morning, through the orchard of 40 olive trees, toward the old house, and everything that happened inside it, and everything that happened next.